Well, thank you all for coming. I suppose I should explain a little bit about what I'm doing here. Joe emailed me about a month ago asking if I could read something for St. Patrick's Day. The difficulty being I don't know very much about St. Patrick, and so I wrote her back and I confessed. I mean, I certainly didn't want to try to pull one over on her, and the more I thought about it, the more I thought that St. Patrick is relatively irrelevant to St. Patrick's Day anyway. He's first of all not Irish. He was a Roman, and he was born of all places in England. I mean, I could understand the Irish kind of adopting him just, if he was Roman, but coming from England, that's pushing it a bit much. And he got all this praise for chasing all the snakes out of Ireland, which is ridiculous, because the snakes never got there, so there were never any snakes there. And no one in his lifetime reported that ever saw him wearing a shamrock. So it seems to me that the real reason that we celebrate St. Patrick's Day is to celebrate the Irish. And there's an added bonus, and that is that quite frequently St. Patrick's Day falls during Lent, and the church leaves all the Lent restrictions suspended for St. Patrick's Day. So even if you've given up alcohol, you can imbibe, which makes St. Patrick's Day particularly appealing. And instead, we celebrate things like Irish gifts, the Blarney, rye whiskey, four-leaf clovers, Irish tenors, shamrocks, leprechauns, urban political machines, which is what we're going to get into today, the lovely lilt of an Irish brogue, and let's not forget Guinness and Riverdance. So this passage I'm going to share with you is from Edwin O'Connor's The Last Hurrah, which is a kind of romantic view of the Irish political machine. And it's based very loosely on the career of James Michael Curley of Boston. In fact, it was published in 1956, and Curley died 2 years later, so he read the novel. He liked the novel, but not until after he had met the author. And he later filed suit against the producers of the movie and won his suit. I'm not sure what offended him, because Spencer Tracy, of all people, played Frank Skeffington, which is the character in the novel. And it is an absolute thrill of a movie. So if you get a chance to see The Last Hurrah, the film, don't miss it. Anyway, the idea is that Skeffington has decided to run again for a fifth time. He had been mayor 4 different times in Boston. He had been governor of the state once in the mid-30s, catastrophe, but not to the Irish. He had been a congressman one term, had been alderman many different times, and all the Protestants were hoping he would retire, and he announced he was going to run again. So he called his nephew, Adam, who was a cartoonist for the local newspaper that was published by a prominent Protestant who hated Skeffington. And so he got a call from Skeffington who said, "Look, this is probably my last hurrah, but I think you should come along with me, because it's really an adventure to see how we run a political campaign." And so Adam said yes, and that's how the novel opens. But Skeffington set off his campaign, and he hadn't contacted Adam yet. So Adam was concerned about that. But that's not what this scene is about, as you'll see. Adam had a swollen expectation, a measure of how little Adam really knew his uncle. It was true that Skeffington wanted Adam on his side. It was also true that he wanted to win an election. But between the two, there was no equation. The latter dominated his thoughts. He had by no means forgotten his nephew. He had merely allocated to him his proper position in the overall scheme of the campaign. At the moment, there were more immediate matters of concern, and one of these was the satisfaction of old John Gorman on the funds for a development within his ward. This was something which could not be postponed. and it would have been an extraordinary circumstance indeed that would have led Skeffington to delay on any project close to John Gorman's heart. He was too close a friend, and he was far too politically influential. Accordingly, the previous week, Skeffington had scheduled 2 unusual interviews. The first had been with Norman Cass, Jr., the son of a banker. He was a blue-eyed man of 40 with a small, finely molded and faintly silly face. His hair, beginning to gray, was trimmed in a perpetual crew cut. Remember, this was 1956 when this was written. He wore a narrow-shouldered suit of tan gabardine, a blue polka dot bow tie, and a pair of old, much-scuffed buckskin shoes. His appearance suggested that of a very old undergraduate. Possibly an apology for his costume, he had entered the office saying, "I'm afraid I've just this minute come up from the country." The lisp was more than perceptible. It leaped out at the auditor so strongly that one became aware of it first and Norman Cass Jr. second. It was a speech defect that had remained despite the resolute determination of Norman Cass Sr. that it should go. From the first, he had gauged his son's capacities. He had realized that these, plus a lisp, constituted an almost insuperable barrier. About the capacities, he could do nothing, but the lisp he could subject to remedial treatment. But nothing had availed. The lisp had hung on stubbornly, and now everything said by Norman Cass, Jr., was given a comic dimension, which, the contents of his words considered, could not have been more superfluous. "Well, very good of you to drop in today," Skeffington had said. "To judge from your appearance, life in the country must be healthy. I imagine golf and tennis play their part in keeping you so bronzed and fit." "Failing principally," his guest had replied, "in a simply superb old sloop." For just an instant, Skeffington had the suspicion that he was being made fun of. Simply superb old sloop. Could such a combination be arrived at by accident? He looked sharply at the face confronting him, that distinguished family face, in this instance, which had been marred by a slight taint of boobery. He concluded that it was possible, after all. He said, "A fascinating vessel, the sloop. Played a major role in the development of our fair city," and he talked for a few minutes about the maritime history of Boston. Only gradually did he lead the conversation into more pertinent channels. He then began to speak of men of opposite political faiths who found it necessary to subordinate their differences in time of civic emergency, and he suggested that indeed such an emergency was close upon them. He spoke of the indispensable man who sometimes arose to save his city. He at first hinted, and then he stated more explicitly, that indispensable man, in this instance, was none other than Norman Cass, Jr. "In short, Mr. Cass," he said solemnly, "I'm telling you that your city needs you. I'm telling you no secret when I say that the best minds of our community are agreed that our new fire commissioner should be Norman Cass, Jr." Fire commissioner? Obviously, the suggestion that he could be of some service was both unexpected and unprecedented. Dazed, he said, "There must be some mistake. I have no political ambitions whatever." "It's not a question of politics, Mr. Cass. I hope you understand that it's above that. It's a question of municipal need, civic duty. I'll wager you already know something about our fire department." "Well, no, not precisely, that is. Of course," he said with a small treble of a giggle, I know that it puts out fires. Exactly, Skeffington said, with a look of congratulations. It puts out fires. You've put your finger right on the key to the whole situation, Mr. Cass, as I knew you would. He had gone on to explain that the fire department at the moment had been shaken in morale, and that as a consequence, inefficiency. The present commissioner had proved a vast disappointment, and what was needed clearly was an able administrator who could restore the department to its former happy state, a man who inspired public confidence and trust, a man who was above the concerns of petty politics. In other words, well, I'm terribly flattered, of course, Cass said, but the truth is that I almost know nothing about the workings of the fire department. As you know, I'm a banker. Well, what was it that Clemenceau once said about war? Skeffington said thoughtfully. He said that it was too important a matter to leave in the hands of generals. How well that expresses my own feelings about our fire department, Mr. Cass. It's too important to leave in the hands of professional firefighters. There had been more explanation. He had insinuated that although he'd been associated with his father at the bank, the junior Cass depended upon no family relationship for his reputation. There had been his work with the wonderful Boy Scout movement, had there not? And the Red Cross. And from there, Skeffington had gone on to stress once more civic duty and the promise of freedom from all political interference. Norman Cass Jr. would be indisputably the boss. Well, again, there was a small giggle. I'd like to do it. I hope I'm as public-spirited as the average citizen, but still, of course, there are disadvantages too, Skeffington said. I won't attempt to conceal them from you, Mr. Cass. Without appearing to, he kept a sharp eye on his visitor as he continued to speak. First of all, I'm afraid you'd be extremely conspicuous. At every major conflagration, you'd be present in a position of command, a recognizable figure in the commissioner's uniform of pure white. I have to admit that you'd be the cynosure of all eyes. And then, in your day-by-day activities, you'd ride in the long maroon commissioner's car, equipped with a siren, of course, and 2 uniformed firemen to attend you. And you'd be traveling at top speed at all times. Along our city streets, other cars would necessarily pull over to the curb to let you pass. And I hesitate to tell you this because I realize that to a man of your reticence, the necessity for traveling about in such a way as to compel constant and universal attention must be distasteful. Still, I tell you because I want you to know just what you'll be getting into. And still, I tell you because I want to be perfectly fair with you. He had seen the blue eyes gleam with interest at the mention of the white uniform. He had seen them glow brighter with each passing word. He knew that he had not mistaken his man. Well, of course, Cass said, I suppose we all must make some sacrifice. And since you put it that way, I don't see how very well I can refuse. Excellent, said Skeffington. I had hoped you won't. But he did not want immediate acceptance. He said, now don't let me stampede you into anything, Mr. Cass. I'd never forgive myself if I rushed you into a hasty decision. I'll tell you what, why don't you sleep on it? Give it a night's consideration. Talk it over with your good wife. And then tomorrow, write me your decision. Needless to say, I hope it'll be favorable. Well, that's extremely considerate of you, Cass said. But under the circumstances, I feel certain that I could give you my answer right now. No, said Skeffington. Still talking, he rose and walked to the other side of the desk. Duplicating his host's action, Cass rose too. Gracefully, the interview came to a close. Cass left the office reluctantly, promising to defer his decision until morning. Skeffington returned to his desk well satisfied. There was some danger in allowing the overnight period of grace, but it was a necessary danger. The written acknowledgement was what he needed. This was the easiest way to secure it. And there was, after all, small chance that the junior Cass would change his mind. Not, Skeffington thought ironically, as long as it was possible to dream of a long maroon car with a siren, streaking along the crowded street in noisy splendor, while on either side motorists hastily came to a stop and watched in awed silence as the erect figure in pure white sped by on his way to quell the flames. And visions of sugar plums danced through his head, Skeffington said aloud. He had little doubt the answer he'd receive. It arrived the following day. Skeffington had taken one look at the letter, had made another telephone call, and 24 hours later, Norman Cass, Sr., was in his office. "You wish to see me?" he said in a quiet, matter-of-fact voice. He was a short, compact, unobtrusive man, and in his face there was no silliness at all. A far different proposition, thought Skeffington, from the son. He was pleased by the visit. Here was a guy with whom he enjoyed going to the mat. There was no one more than this shrewd, calm, tough financier, so well born, so rich, so utterly ruthless. "Well, I naturally hated to intrude upon your day," he said, "but a matter of some urgency arose, and I thought we might be able to settle it in a few minutes of friendly conversation." Absently, he fingered the skull ashtray on his desk, and then he lifted it for his visitor's inspection. "Interesting object here. Said to be the skull of our first Republican governor. They seem to have had remarkably small heads in those days, no?" "Well, as you know," Cass said emotionlessly, "the first Republican governor of this state happens to have been an ancestor of mine. And since his bones, including those of his skull, are at present in the family vault at Mount Andrews Cemetery, I really don't think your story has a great deal of foundation to it." "Well, bless my soul," said Skeffington. "I'd completely forgotten that there was a family connection." He seemed surprised, even contrite. Actually, he was delighted. It had been a fine opening gambit, a keynote to happy accomplishment. He said, "I seem to have been victimized by a charlatan. I had been sold the skull of a spurious Republican." Cass nodded politely. "There was some specific matter you wished to discuss, I believe?" "I do indeed. Little matter of municipal finance. Hardly worth bothering you about under most circumstances, but we seem to have struck a few snags. Now, you're a busy man, Mr. Cass, and I don't see any reason why we should drag this out. To put it in a nutshell, I'd like to have you reconsider your position on that loan to the city." Cass shook his head slightly. "I'm afraid that's impossible. We've already given it thorough consideration. Our decision was unanimous." "Ah, so I heard. I was hoping you might make it a little less unanimous. You see, Mr. Cass, it's not an ordinary loan. I know this doesn't come within the purview of the banker, but you're also one of our leading citizens. And I should think the fact that much of the money is to go for a children's playground might make some difference on purely humanitarian grounds. You know how crowded conditions are over in Ward 9? Every day there's an accident because little boys and girls are playing in congested streets. You can't blame them. There's nowhere else to play. Now, I think our young people are important, and I'm sure you do too. I think that the city owes them a decent playground with proper facilities indoors and out. But Mr. Cass, we can't give it to them unless we have the money, and we can't get the money unless you loan it to us. That's why I want you to think of the purpose of the loan. That's why I beg you to reconsider." "As you say," Cass said, "we're not, as bankers, primarily interested in the purpose of the loan. But as you also say, we're citizens too, and I can assure you that this purpose of which you speak was considered. We agree that the conditions in Ward 9 were deplorable. I believe we also agreed upon whose shoulders the blame For this must rest. We feel as you apparently feel that some sort of recreational project is needed. However, some of us seem to consider and remember that in the past, loans were granted for similar purposes and the results achieved were hardly satisfactory. What work was done at prohibitive cost. And more than that, as bankers responsible for our investors' money, we also remembered that we became considerably concerned about the risk involved. We feel that the risk is now greater than ever, and that it would be unwise to grant any loan at this time. Now, while we sympathize with the need for such money, we prefer to wait until the municipal situation has changed to some extent before we gratify that need. I think that's about all I can tell you. Well, what could be fairer than that, Skeffington said, spreading his hands in a gesture of satisfaction. I appreciate your frankness, Mr. Cass. I'll even confess to you that up until now, I've been harboring an unworthy suspicion. I suspected that just possibly you might be doing this in order to embarrass me and my administration during an election year. There's no doubt that if the loan's refused, it'll do just that. So you see, Mr. Cass, I'm returning frankness for frankness. Would you believe that I had a suspicion of that nature? I have no control over your suspicions, sir. Well, and you have, apparently, over my destiny. Of course, he said, if just by chance that suspicion were correct, I almost think it might be justified in taking the whole matter before the public. Properly put in the newspapers, I imagine a story like that could arouse considerable antagonism toward a man, particularly if he were a banker. Speaking for myself, I like bankers. They're a fine, public-spirited breed of men, but the public as a whole don't share that liking. They're rather inclined to be hostile. And if the word got around that one especial banker was blocking a health and happiness program for little children, I suppose there might even be a hue and cry against him. What do you suppose, Mr. Cass? For the first time, the faintest smile appeared on Cass's impassive face. I suppose, he said, that this banker, knowing that people with whom he was about to deal, would have anticipated such a possibility and would have instructed his attorneys accordingly. I further suppose that any public reaction, if it should take place, would seem to him to be merely one of the expected hazards of his profession, and that it would not affect him too seriously. He'd be a brave man, your banker. I'd hope for his sake that he'd fully realize what he was doing, but enough of speculation, Mr. Cass. Let's get back to you. Would you say your decision is final? I would, sir. And Cass got to his feet. No possibility of reconsideration? None whatever. Skeffington sighed. You're a hard man to do business with, Mr. Cass. I suppose that's the secret of your success. However, if that's your position, I don't see that there's anything more to say. I did my best. Man can but try. You seem to have won. I congratulate you. For just an instant, a flickering part of a second, a light appeared in the small brown eyes of the compact little man who stood so trim, immaculate, so victorious before him. Then it died, and Norman Cass said, "Good day, sir." It was not until then that Skeffington released his bomb. One moment, he said. From his desk, he took the letter written by Norman Cass, Jr., and he handed it to the father. I was so absorbed in your words, I almost forgot to show this to you. Have a look at it. Have a good look at it. I think you might find it interesting. Cass read the short letter swiftly. He looked up at Skeffington, then read the letter again, and he said steadily, "What is this foolishness?" "Well, it's a major civic appointment that's in the offing. This is the letter of acceptance from a potential appointee. You may keep it if you wish," he added thoughtfully. "I believe I have several photostatic copies." Cass continued to regard him with a fixed, emotionless stare. "What do you hope to gain by this?" he said finally. "Nothing but the valued services of a respected citizen." "Who's the son of a respected citizen?" Skeffington replied. "The boy was made for the job, don't you think?" Nonsense. You have no intention of appointing him. You know it and I know it. Ah, but does he know it? Skeffington said. Apparently not. Here's his letter of consent. It occurred to me that we might use it as a basis for further discussion. We have nothing to discuss. I don't know how you got this. I don't know what use you hope to make of it. In any event, it's worthless. If you attempt to do anything with it, I can assure you my son will repudiate it immediately. Ah, but can he? Skeffington asked. Or even will he? I wonder. I had a revealing talk with the boy the other day. He seemed to me to be rather eager to feel the spotlight raised upon him. I suppose that's the natural consequence of having lived so long in the shadow of a successful father. You want to get out in the sunshine and grow by yourself for a change. And sometimes a kind stranger comes along and shows you how you can do it. So then maybe you could force him to repudiate it. Then again, maybe you couldn't. I'm sure I don't know, but I'm equally sure I don't care. Because it won't make the slightest difference what he does, one way or the other. The situation isn't exactly under his control any longer, or yours either, if it comes to that. He leaned forward, partially supporting himself with his arms on the desk. It was the old familiar position of command. In a tone which was only slightly more businesslike, he said, "Have a seat, Mr. Cass. I think it's time to talk a little turkey." Cass said nothing. He remained standing, then slowly, and still looking steadily at Skeffington, he sat down. "Now, here's the position as I see it. I have this letter from your son. He says he wants to be fire commissioner. All right, I intend to appoint him. You don't believe that now, but you may in a minute, particularly when it all appears in the newspapers. I intend to appoint him and leave him to his own devices. His own devices, Mr. Cass. You're fairly familiar with them, I believe. Now, here's what I'm worrying about. How long would that boy last in a job which he doesn't know the first thing about, and where every politician in the city will be after him, first, because he got the job, and second, because he's your son? In some quarters, Mr. Cass, you are not a much-loved man. I'm very much afraid that they'd be apt to put him in the bag so quick that it'd make your head spin. And within 2 months of his appointment, every paper in the city, with the exception of Amos's, of course, will be screaming for his resignation. There will be charges of incompetence, even of graft. I don't imagine the boy with his limited experience will know how to protect himself against that one. Well, if that happened, you can see what my position would have to be. I'd have to step in and remove him from office. By that time, of course, the family name would be all muddied up. And then, too, for my own protection, because this is an election year, you will remember, I'd have to explain that I made a grievous mistake in the appointment, but that I had naturally assumed that a member of one of our most famous families would be above such behavior, and that my trust had been badly abused. And so, much as I hate even to suggest such an unhappy development, I'm afraid your son would leave office in disgrace. That wouldn't be so good, would it, Mr. Cass? Again, the light showed in Cass's eyes. But it was now a light of quite a different sort. And now it didn't flicker and disappear. It remained burning directly across the table at the heavy face whose features were still relaxed, but whose light blue eyes were as steady as his own. Still, Cass did not speak. A lifetime spent in the politely savage background of his profession had given him a high opinion of silence and self-control. He continued to listen. He had grasped instantly the desperate nature of his predicament, but there was still one way out. It was a way Skeffington proceeded to close. Well, now, you know, there is this possibility that your son, doubtless at your insistence, might turn around and refuse the appointment. Or, as you said, repudiate the letter. In that case, I imagine there'd be nothing left for me to do but to protect myself. I'd be forced into it. I might even have to tell a little white lie, just to prevent anything like that happening. I might have to start a rumor circulating that your son had been offered the post, I suppose then I'd have to come out with a denial of the whole thing and give the letter of acceptance to the papers and explain that the boy had been the victim of a delusion, that the job had never been offered to him in the first place. I'd have to say something to the effect that he came to see me some time ago, offered his services to the city, specifying that he would like a position of authority commensurate with his position in the community. I might have to go on to say that while I respectfully and immediately declined his kind offer, he somehow acquired the fantastic notion that he was to be appointed fire commissioner, and that he wrote me a letter accepting what in fact I'd never offered him. This would be an extraordinary story, and you and I, of course, would be conscious of a little exaggeration in it here and there, but I think it would be believed by the public, particularly if I should point out his absolute lack of qualifications for the job, plus the fact that I'd hardly offer it to the son of an old political enemy. And then, of course, we have his own letter. So I suppose, Mr. Cass, that the result of this alternative would be not disgrace, but ridicule. It wouldn't be surprised, I wouldn't be surprised, if you and your son and your family became the laughingstock of the city an hour after the papers hit the street. And just by the way, I think I should point out that any attempt to forestall this by beating me to the punch, by going to the papers before me, for example, would unhappily fail. A little reflection will show you that there's no possible way of doing it without making your son a perfect boob. So there you have it. It's a situation that gives me some concern. Now, I don't quite know what to do about it. He looked solicitously at his old antagonist. Got any ideas? Now Cass spoke. The light was still in his eyes, but his voice was perfectly controlled. Typical, he said contemptuously, cheap and vicious and thoroughly typical of you and all that you represent. Skeffington shook his head slowly. It won't work, Mr. Cass. I realize I'm supposed to redden with shame at the thought of playing dirty pool against a distinguished opponent like yourself. But it won't work. I don't know why. Maybe it's because I just this moment happen to remember who it was who every year delivers a bleak little statement about the pitiable plight of the people in our slums, but who owns large property holdings in those slums. And they're all shabby buildings, not fit for dogs. Or maybe it's because I also remember that it's that very same man who engineered the merger of Consolidated Trust with the old Mason Street Trust in such a way that one of his partners and oldest friends was driven to suicide. So I guess you could say that this man has quite a pool table of his own. And after having watched the kind of game he's played over the years, I don't believe I'm inclined to feel terribly remorseful right now. But I don't want to waste the time of a busy man like yourself in these little asides, Mr. Cass. The main problem before us right now is that you seem to be in a bit of a situation. And I'm still waiting to hear if you've thought of any suitable way out. For a moment, Cass didn't answer at all. Then he jerked his head forward once, rose quickly. Very well, we'll re-examine the application for the loan. Oh, no, Skeffington said. Not good enough. Try again. All right, Cass said sharply. You'll get the money. Skeffington nodded. That's much better. Bless my soul if I don't think you found a way out. For the second time today, I congratulate you, and I'll leave it to you to explain matters to your son. May I? He's a young man of high spirits and eager ambition. He's bound to be slightly disappointed. You can soothe him by pointing out to him the error of his ways. I need hardly add that all evidence of that error will be handed over to you in the very near future. Say, for example, on the very day the loan comes through. Cass, during this speech, had turned his back on Skeffington, had walked briskly to the door. Nothing was clearer than that he neither required nor wished to be escorted from this office. At the door, he stopped and made his farewell. Very well. You've got what you wanted. I tell you now that it's a victory you may regret. Ah, I have many regrets. One is that our little talk this afternoon didn't take place 20 years ago. So one more regret won't make much difference. It might even be something to look forward to. Goodbye, Mr. Cass. Give my best to the family. It was the final insult, but Cass refused to be baited. He closed the door quickly, furious. He was nevertheless in complete command of himself. He walked briskly down the antiquated, ill-kept halls. He was moving along the unfamiliar route. He saw and passed the whispering confidential knots of beefy men. Instinctively, his mouth tightened, for he recognized in them the marauders, the representatives of that boisterous, crafty, and despised breed of latter-day Goths who had come to sack his city and had remained to enjoy their plunder. Yet despite his dislike of the Irish, Cass had not ignored them. He had studied them carefully, just as he had studied the Jews and more recently the Italians. Like some lone defender of the human race, unexpectedly confronted with an invading host of vermin. He had studied them in the interest of his own survival. The reported wit and charm of these Irish strangers had completely eluded him, but he had found in them qualities that he did like: sentimentality, intemperance, verbosity, best of all, lack of financial acumen. These were the little vices which in others became for Cass useful virtues. Like Skeffington, he was a realist. He knew that direct control of this city was no longer possible to him and his associates. The big immigrations had ended that forever. But there was, however, consolation in indirect control. Cass found that few things were denied him who held the purse, and no one held it more firmly than he. A first-class financier, he regarded with chill amusement the efforts of the newer group to intrude upon his domain. And for the individual members of this group, he felt nothing but distaste and contempt. So he had been defeated, a victim both of Skeffington and his own idiot son. Defeat demanded retaliation. He would repay both, and he did not lack confidence in his ability to do so. As for Skeffington, there were the November elections, and Cass resolved to get in touch with Amos Force immediately. He had been approached by the publisher, who had suggested that he lend his support to a coalition group now forming behind the young candidate McCluskey. He had been cool to the proposal of his old friend, for while naturally he desired to defeat Skeffington, he was attracted neither to the heterogeneous alliance which was to fight for him, nor for the young non-entity that they were going to back. To have committed his resources to such a group this morning would have been unthinkable, but to do so now, in the light of the insupportable provocation, was unavoidable. He would call Amos Force within an hour, and he would declare himself irrevocably in. And as for his son, arriving at the bank, he went directly to his son's office. Norman Cass Jr. was seated behind his desk, dictating the inconsequential memoranda with which he was habitually entrusted. At his father's unprecedented entrance, he looked up in astonishment. "Why, Dad," he said, "this is a surprise." His father said nothing. An abrupt motion of his head sent his son's secretary scurrying from the room. Then he said ominously, "I imagine I should call you Mr. Commissioner." The long, silly face flushed. "So you know," his son said weakly. "I hadn't planned to say anything yet. I wanted you to be surprised." "You were successful." "I was surprised." And then the stony self-control, which had withstood the humiliating shafts of Skeffington, broke down before the ogling, vacant face before him. "This is my son," he thought in a spasm of agony. Aloud, he suddenly screamed, "You fool! You utter goddamned imbecile!" And for the next quarter hour, Norman Cass Jr. had a very bad time of it indeed. Hope you enjoyed it.